You've probably heard of a CDN, Content Delivery Network. If you haven't, it's a way to speed up your website when you have a global audience. And let me reiterate that, global audience. If you're in Sydney, for example, and your clients are in Sydney, then you don't necessarily need a CDN because you should locate your server in Sydney as well. So everything is in Sydney. Then there's no need for a CDN. But when you have a global audience, so for example, you're in Sydney, your clients are in Melbourne, they're in Perth, they're in London, and your server is in Singapore, then a CDN is perfect for that situation. Let's have a look a bit more about CDNs. Let's take a look. So here's an example of Cloudflare. Cloudflare is a CDN. And as you can see here, these are all the different server locations around the world. So it's pretty cool, including getting one in Iceland, which is amazing. I didn't know that. And if you're in Australia, you can see they have very good coverage in Australia. They don't have one in the north in Darwin, which would be helpful, but certainly all down on the east and on the west, they've got locations. They've got brilliant coverage of America. So as you can imagine, let me give you a scenario now. Here you are in New Zealand, which if you're wondering where my accent is from, that's one of the places my accent is from. I was actually born in the UK. Let's imagine that you created a website and you're living in New Zealand and your clients are mainly in North America over here. Now, where would you locate your data center from your server? Well, first of all, if 80% or more of your clients are over here in North America, you must locate your server there as well. Because the closer you are to the server, then the better. The closer your CDN is to your server, then the better too. Imagine that you've decided to locate your server here in Los Angeles. That's your actual raw server. Now, if you join up for the Cloudflare network, it will take copies of your file and spread them throughout every single data center in the world. Now, if somebody over here in Iceland requests a particular page from your website, it will go to the locust data center, which in fact is in Iceland. It doesn't have to come all the way back over here to Los Angeles to pick up your files. It can pick them up locally. That saves a huge amount of time because there's something called latency, which is the time it takes from information to travel from Los Angeles to Iceland, which is Reykjavik. I've never been there. I do want to visit. So that time delay is called latency. How long does it take? And remember, there's backwards and forwards going on of the data here, especially if they're filling out forms and filling out information on your website. That latency can take you a long time. Approximately that distance here is around 1 second to maybe 1.5 seconds. From Iceland down to New Zealand could be up to 2 seconds, if not a little bit more in latency. That's a huge distance. Let's have a look at another CDN. This is StackPath. Now, I'm not affiliated with Cloudflare or StackPath in any shape or form. They're both pretty good CDNs. If you're going to choose a CDN, though, you need to have a look about the service distribution centers, where their servers are. So, for example, if your audience is in Europe, you got very good coverage in Europe. But if your audience is in Australia, your coverage is very low. Where Cloudflare network, of course, Europe is a lot better, but the distance between, for example, Berlin and Ireland is very little. So it won't make any difference because they've got an Irish server in Dublin and they've got one in Amsterdam. So basically the distance from Berlin to Amsterdam is so little, and they've got one in Frankfurt. So that doesn't really make any difference. But if your audience is in China, for example, then you can see Cloudflare has a good distribution in China, where StackPath really doesn't. It has in northern India and over here in Korea, but there's actually nothing in China except, well, there's Hong Kong. So these are the decisions you need to make if you're going to choose a CDN. Now, let's go back to the original situation whereby you're in New Zealand and your clients are mainly in Australia. Your server, you should look in Australia. And then, if, for example, 80% of your clients are on the East Coast, then you could use StackPath or you can use Cloudflare, because you can see on Cloudflare, they've got a very good coverage on the East Coast. It doesn't really make any difference. So then it just comes down to price. Distribution and speed is not an issue. It's just basically a price. Where would you locate your server? Well, you should locate your server in one of the key centers here, probably in Sydney. And that means then your distribution will be very good. Because anywhere, if you used Cloudflare, anywhere over here, for example, Perth, if your server's over here, then they've got a data center over here, so you'll have very good speed over in Perth. Otherwise, the latency between Sydney and Perth is around half a second. And remember, this is half a second on each time you need to connect with the server. So if there's a lot of backwards and forwards going on, then that time builds up for the client. There are some additional benefits to CDNs, and that also is security. So Cloudflare has a lot of other different services as well as StackPath. I'm sure they have those too. So there you go. Hopefully that was really good and very useful information. So the big tip is, do not necessarily think CDN will speed your site up. If your real server and your audience are close together, you don't need a CDN, and you shouldn't use a CDN. Roughly, my rule of thumb is 1,000 kilometers. If your 80% of your audience is within 1,000 kilometers of your source server, do not use a CDN, because it's an extra layer in your stack, in your website stack, and it complicates your site a lot. And it gives you another layer of caching, which again makes it a lot more complicated. So only use CDNs when you truly have a global audience and you want to reach a global audience, in some of the examples I've given.